First thing we're going to do is have an overview of what CMSP, as you'll hear it called a lot, is. And Paul Dye from Nature Conservancy is going to give sort of a general overview and show some examples of case studies. And then Jennifer Hennessy will be talking about an overview sort of from the Washington State governmental perspective on this whole process, where we're at on that. And then Matt will explain about the Washington Marine Planner interface, which has been practiced or sort of set up as an example in Pacific County.
So I'll step through this very quickly, but I think we've got plenty of time for question and answers, and I'm hoping it's fairly informal conversation, so we'll pause at each point, but you can interrupt me if you want to. So let's go ahead. In my mind, in a very simplistic way, coastal marine spatial planning helps us ask this question of ourselves: what do you want from your ocean? And come back with an intelligent answer, given everything that people might have in the way of opinions about that. Like we've got one more person coming in, so pausing for a second is probably really cool.
Yeah.
Hi. So we're just getting started, and I think we'll just keep going. This is the first slide. I'm Paul Dye with the Nature Conservancy.
Thank you. I'm Laura Young, representative Steve Manager's office.
Oh, wonderful. Great. Thanks for coming. And here's our agenda. I don't think it's too hard to catch up. As I say, we just barely got started. Thanks for being here. So, as I was saying, coastal marine spatial planning in a simple way is just a way to ask the question, what do you want from your ocean? And then get a range of opinions and a lot of information underneath that question in order to make decisions about how to go forward. The ocean's getting increasingly busy. We rely on it for a wide variety of things. And we've got some new uses, perhaps heading our way. At least people are interested in them. And as we've begun using the ocean increasingly for a wider and wider variety of things, it's become stressful for our management system, let's say. So let's go through a couple of points here. The way we run ocean management in the United States right now is with a pretty big group of federal agencies, state agencies, and then on Washington's coast, a unique aspect of ocean resource management here is that we have coastal treaty tribes with rights to some of those resources and responsibilities as co-trustees for some of those resources. So, as I said, with the increasing number of uses that we're facing in the ocean, we get an increasing potential for conflict, as well as disparities between the authorities of the individual agencies that manage those resources. And historically, we've done the management on a sector-by-sector basis. We have fisheries management councils that set management regulations. We have US EPA and our own Department of Ecology that set things like water quality standards that affect the ocean. And it's kind of been, stovepipes of authorities dealing with individual issues. But as we sort of pile into the ocean with more issues, it becomes harder to sort that stuff out. And in places where the ocean has gotten very, very busy, much busier than off of our coast here, it's gotten to be a very stressful situation. So I'm going to walk through just a few examples of where coastal marine spatial planning have been used elsewhere or are being used elsewhere in the United States, just to give you a flavor of what this thing is and what people are using it to accomplish. So let's take a look at the next one. This is the definition of marine spatial planning that is in the President's new federal ocean policy, national ocean policy. It leans heavily on an international definition of coastal marine spatial planning that has been used for a number of years. I'm going to simplify this into a few bullet points. Go ahead. Basically, the goal is to find compatible places and times for all of the ocean activities that people want to put in them. To go through an integrated, multiple objective process to balance those uses out with one another, or say no to some if they're incompatible with the primary uses people want to put the ocean to. Uses a lot of science and technology, but most important, and this is something that the Nature Conservancy feels very strongly about, we need to bring the knowledge and opinions of people into the planning process. Science alone is not going to tell us what to do. We've got to have people who know about the ocean, spend time there and care about it, participating in the planning process to get good results. And as you'll see when we turn to the planning tools that Matt is involved in developing, a lot of the Conservancy's effort in developing these planning tools has been to make them accessible to ordinary people so that they can participate fully in the decision-making process. By doing this multi-sector, multi-objective approach, it helps the agencies collaborate more smoothly. And one of the things that the Nature Conservancy hopes to get out of this on a nationwide and even worldwide basis, we work on CMSP in a number of countries in the world, is efficiency in the management regime. We're actually hoping that CMSP can save us money in terms of government expenditures by getting the decisions right, getting them more fully integrated so that the agency's roles are clear and they are collaborating more fully with one another. Okay. The basic technology and information support for coastal and marine spatial planning works in geographic information systems. You bring scientific information into the computer system and map it out in GIS data layers, produce computerized maps that talk about both the uses and the resources that the uses need to access, as well as the space they need to access. And then by creating these interactive tools, you let people drill into this information and use it to make decisions or propose decisions as part of the planning process. In a real simple way, that's how the technology works that Matt is going to explain to you in more detail later on this evening. So here's an example of coastal and marine spatial planning put to work in a particular context on the east coast of the United States. This is Boston Harbor, and this is a national marine sanctuary, the Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary. There are huge shoals out here, and the reason the Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary was established is because it's an important feeding area for whales, right whales in particular. Right whales are right whales and are called right whales because they were kind of slow moving and dumb, and as a consequence the whalers, the early whalers in North America, targeted right whales in particular. They're still kind of slow and a little bit dumb, so they tend to get in the way of shipping. And the way most of the big ships came into Boston Harbor in the past was along this path that's shown by the dotted line. By using the tools of coastal and marine spatial planning and some technology that let them listen to the whales and pinpoint their position over time, they were able to map out the areas that the whales occupied the most. So these heat maps, where it's red in the center and then bleeds out to blue, is actually telling us where the whales are most likely to be found when they're on the banks and feeding. So what this revealed is there's a high density area where the whales often are up here, another one here where the ships had been coming right across the area where the whales wanted to be. And by shifting the incoming and outgoing shipping lanes, they cut the number of whale strikes down really remarkably. Now, it didn't take a lot of public opinion to drive this decision. It's largely a scientific and technical display of what you can do with the tools of coastal and marine spatial planning. In this case, the use conflict was between the whales and the shipping industry. And it was solved largely technically, and then by talking to the shipping industry and getting them engaged in the solution. So the theme here is you can reduce conflicts. Let's go to the next one. Here's an example from Rhode Island that illustrates how coastal marine spatial planning might be used to find space for new uses in the ocean. In this case, Rhode Island was the recipient of proposals to build offshore wind farms. And the question was, with all of what's going on off of tiny little Rhode Island's coast, where the heck are we going to find room for wind farms? So what these different kinds of shading describe are places where there's a lot of fishing with mobile gear, that's these red hatched places, places where recreational fishing occurs, and places where fixed gear fishing, pot fishing, occurs. And by working with the fishermen in all three of those sectors over time and mapping out the places that were most valuable to them, they were able to map out places by subtraction where fishing activity is not real strong, but where wind resources, in fact, might be high. So by overlaying those things, getting people engaged in the planning process, they found spaces that could be appropriate for siting some of the windmills while still avoiding an impact on their existing users, the fishermen. So then here's a third example, which is just in the making. At the same time that the state of Washington is beginning to get involved with coastal marine spatial planning, the 5 mid-Atlantic states are moving into coastal marine spatial planning as a multi-state unit under this new national ocean policy construct. So this is a regional ocean planning body beginning its work. This is a screenshot of their planning tool. The Nature Conservancy and EcoTrust are providing the technology under this planning process as well. And this is just demonstrating their planning area across 5 states. And in terms of this, this issue of improving coordination in government, this is a great example where individual state governments are collaborating to get their coastal and ocean uses planned out jointly so that they can coordinate their activities and their regulations and siting rules and things like that together. That allows them to have a more efficient interface with the federal agencies that have the offshore management responsibilities. Okay. So this last slide is just to remind us that while coastal marine spatial planning is kind of a new kid on the block, and there's a certain amount of buzz about it if you're in the business like we are of ocean resource management, in Washington, it really is standing on decades of solid work in terms of coastal and ocean resource management. A lot of things have happened in the state of Washington that now enable us to bring the coastal marine spatial planning into play and do a better job of managing our ocean resources. But it's only because we've done this work in advance that it makes sense now to be bringing coastal marine spatial planning into the fore. So we're not bringing a planning process that's brand new and starting over from scratch. It's a question of building on what we've done in the past and using this tool to try to make it more efficient and more effective and anticipate some of the future pressures that we're going to have on our coastal oceans.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is take us the next step along the line and talk more about what's going on here in Washington around marine spatial planning. And you'll hear those terms: marine spatial planning, coastal marine spatial planning, CMSP, MSP, interchangeably, thinking the same thing essentially. Paul did a good job of giving us that broad sense of what is it. Kind of what I'm going to try and do is lay out why is it going on here. What does it mean? Why should it be important to you all? And specifically, I'm going to give some context, talk about the state legislation that we have and the framework that's been established so far, talk a bit about related state policies and programs as well as federal policies and programs, and then give you a status report about where we're at and what we see in the coming months. So Paul also did a good job of laying this out. Why do we need planning? There are new uses of the ocean that are being proposed and that have been proposed on our coast, like renewable energy. There's increasing pressures and demands by existing users. Shipping traffic's going up, and that can lead to conflicts among those uses. And then because I work for the government, this is one that actually is really interesting to me, is about government efficiency and integration. It's probably boring to most people on the outside, but it makes a lot of sense. And the fact that we have all these different authorities involved with managing these resources, providing a way to integrate that and provide an umbrella for those agencies to exercise their independent authorities, but that you have a common information framework and a common vision that everybody is working under. So as I mentioned, renewable energy is definitely a planning driver. Some of you may remember the Finnevera project off of Macaw Bay that was proposed several years ago. That was a pilot project for a wave buoy There was also this other project down in Grace Harbor that was sort of a wind-wave combined project. These all occurred right prior to the economy falling out, and these are new technologies, so in this kind of economic reality that we're living in right now, we're not seeing a lot of these proposals move forwards. In fact, these ones are no longer on the table. But we definitely know there's an interest here from some industries in renewable energy on our coast. So why else is it going on? In these two factors, and they're interrelated. So in 2010, the Washington State Legislature passed a state law on coastal marine spatial planning, and it called for comprehensive marine spatial planning for all of our state waters. And I'll talk a little bit more about what exactly that law entails. But it was also in response to this national ocean policy that was coming underway. And one of the 9 priorities under this national ocean policy that the president adopted is for coastal marine spatial planning. And it's really looking broader, more regionally. And by regionally, we mean large marine ecosystems. Those are like the whole California current, the entire stretch of the West Coast, from Cape Flattery all the way down to Baja. So that's a big area. And there's the ability under this federal framework to break it up into sort of sub-regions that make sense. But the idea is really more in those federal waters, trying to get all those federal agencies together, and then bringing together states and tribes. So part of the idea behind the state law was getting our state stuff together so that we can plug into that effort in a much better and more comprehensive way. So here's the definition in our state law of marine spatial planning. It's a public process of analyzing and allocating the spatial and temporal distribution of human activities in marine environments to achieve ecological, economic, and social objectives. So some key pieces there. Paul talked about the public process. It's a process that requires public involvement and engagement. It also focuses on uses in time and space, so spatial and temporal. And some hallmarks of our state law is that it's about coordinating decisions. It specifically has language that says it's non-regulatory. So we're not adding a new permit or a new layer of bureaucracy. We're really about integrating and bringing the information to the table that the agencies can then act on within their existing authorities. It's using that spatial data, so Paul talked about those maps, looking at information in that format can be really helpful way of seeing, getting a picture of what's going on, where the important resources and uses are occurring. Proactive, so the idea here is to get ahead of project by project type proposals that you have ahead of time, looking at all of this information together and trying to figure out what makes the most sense, rather than having a project proponent come in and say, well, I'm kind of interested right there. That ahead of time you've looked at some of that information and said, well, actually, not so much right there. How about maybe over here? And then multi-use, so looking at the multiple uses of our ocean. So the state law directs state agencies to do a few things. We're supposed to compile and incorporate spatial data into our current plans, develop guidance on the operation and siting of renewable energy facilities, and then conduct comprehensive marine spatial planning for all of Washington waters. Tall order. There were amendments to the law that just passed this last spring, and those were important amendments because before those amendments took effect, there was a very important clause that said we couldn't use state money to do any of this. And so because we didn't have any money to do anything, we didn't do anything. It's very hard to make a planning process work if you have no money. One of those clauses was to remove that clause of that state funding. So state funding can now be used, and I'll talk a little bit more, but we actually do have some state funding for this remaining, this next year to start implementing this. And then the other couple amendments were around really focusing on this coast, developing a plan for the Pacific coast as opposed to Puget Sound. And between now and 2016, really focusing our efforts out here. There's a lot of energy and enthusiasm out here and a lot of need. And so the legislature really felt that that should be our focus, and it lines up with where we've been focusing our attention as well. And then it more clearly separated these geographies. So we can proceed with a plan here without pulling in the rest of the Washington Waters part that we have to complete at some point. And that's the other thing, is that we no longer have a deadline. So given that resources have been scarce up until this year, it's recognizing that it might take us a while to complete this process, and it depends on future funding. So here are the required elements of our state plan. So we have to do an ecosystem assessment and develop ecosystem indicators. When I say that, the law doesn't really define what an ecosystem assessment is, but it talks about things like threats, status and trends. And the term ecosystem typically means not just the biological resources and physical resources, but also the human and social element. So when we're talking about that, we're talking about all of those things. That's a lot. We have to have management measures that could be implemented. Series of maps, so again, these kinds of planning processes have lots of maps, lots of map data. There's the law spells out specifically a few of those maps that need to be done. We're supposed to provide recommendations on federal waters. So again, the idea is that this planning process can help influence what goes on in federal waters, and I'll talk about more specifically about how that happens a little later. We have to be able to implement it, so have a plan for implementing it, and then the one use that's specifically called out is renewable energy, providing a framework around that. So core principles and process. So the law spells out, they don't call them goals and objectives, but there are some ways that we have to develop the plan, so how we develop the plan, and the what, the content, what we're trying to achieve. So I'm just going to read those off because I think they're really helpful to get a sense of the breadth of this planning. So we need to recognize and respect existing uses and tribal treaty rights, promote the protection and restoration of ecosystem processes to enable long-term sustainable production of ecosystem goods and services, address potential impacts of climate change and sea level rise, foster and encourage sustainable uses that provide economic opportunity without significant adverse environmental impacts, preserve and enhance public access, protect and encourage working waterfronts, and support the infrastructure necessary to sustain marine industry, commercial shipping, shellfish aquaculture, and other water-dependent uses. Foster public participation in decision-making and significant involvement of the communities adjacent to the state's marine waters. And those are the main ones. So you can see that there are some that talk about how we develop the plan, and then there are some that talk about what the plan is supposed to do. But it's pretty comprehensive. So we did a report to the legislature that just took us the next step because this law is kind of broad. In particular, it calls for an interagency team to coordinate the development of these plans. So we have an interagency team. It's called the State Ocean Caucus that is made up of all the major natural resource agencies with authority over the marine environment. And the governor designated ecology as the lead agency to help coordinate and implement this law. So that's why I'm here as opposed to somebody from Fish and Wildlife, but we work very closely together on this effort. So some of the recommendations in that report, they were seeing renewable energy as a key driver for this planning process and a reason for us to be doing a planning process. They recommended these separate plans, so doing different regions, because that makes a lot of sense based on the resources and the uses. And then had some draft recommended goals and objectives based on an analysis of where current agency mandates were. And one of the things in the law is that we need to be consistent within current state policies and programs. So it's all about, again, that integration rather than trying to create another layer. So I mentioned that planning is a public process. So this is one way to visualize what we've been building to help us with the planning process. And this is actually to help us with ocean policy overall. So I mentioned the State Ocean Caucus, that's in the purple triangle. We have the tribes, and we're working on setting up a forum with the tribes that recognizes them as governments, a way of communicating on ocean policy issues. We also have communication with the federal and local governments that have authorities that we're working on. And then we, just this last year, set up what is now called Washington's Coastal Marine Advisory Council. So it's an advisory group made up of stakeholders, Marine Resource Committee representatives on the coast to help advise the State Ocean Caucus on all ocean policy issues, but in particular marine spatial planning is a big focus right now. And then in terms of the public process, we also need the general public involved, and we need scientific input, and so those will need to be part of the process throughout the process as well. Same process a lot. So just to call out some of the related state authorities and policies. Fish and Wildlife manages fisheries and habitat. Natural Resources and State Parks are land managers primarily, so Department of Natural Resources issues aquatic leases for activities that affect the seabed. Ecology, my agency, works with Shoreline Management Act, water quality. We're also the home of the State Coastal Program. So you can see this gets at Paul's thing of there's lots of agencies with lots of roles, lots of history here, and how can we bring this together to integrate it? Right. For those of you that haven't been engaged too much in terms of how projects are assessed, when a project comes in the door, it needs to get, depending on what it looks like, many different approvals. And this is at the project scale. And what we were seeing with renewable energy is you get a project coming in the door and it needs to meet all of these things. But we have no sense in terms of that broad scale of having an immediate gut reaction of, is that an okay place or not? Do we have to go through this whole process in order to figure out that there's one of these agencies that's gonna say, that's right in the middle of prime crabbing ground. So by having a planning process, you can skip over this and get to know quicker in some areas and get to places that are much more efficient in terms of the permitting process up front. So you save that time by the agencies. Just one other, well, two other state level pieces that I wanted to mention that provide sort of a policy backing. We have an Ocean Resources Management Act, very little known act, that sets out some broad policies and permitting criteria for ocean uses. And the exceptions are that it's not meant to manage fisheries or recreational uses. So that was set forth. But the idea was at the time it was passed was when oil and gas was being proposed off of our coast. And so they were seeing new uses and wanted to provide a framework for some broad policies for ocean uses. Unfortunately, the mechanism for making that actually implementable has been less than effective. And so marine spatial planning can actually improve how well this law and its policies are applied by all the agencies by providing the information base. Because we've got some good policies out there, but without the information to actually look at and make that assessment of whether a project is meeting those policies, we need both. Yeah, Rich?
So this becomes the regulatory component of all of this?
Sort of. So the way that this is actually implemented, the one place that we developed regulations is actually through our shoreline master programs, through the guidelines for local shoreline master programs. And there's a part 4 that just applies to the 4 counties out here, which is the ocean management criteria. And largely those were not then adopted into the local programs. So they're still just sort of sitting there. And there would be a great mechanism if we had this information framework to then develop more specific local criteria within that construct that would then be the sort of the hook, the regulatory hook, to take those policies and actually take them down to the ground. So, Rod's nodding his head, but for those that know shoreline master programs, that would be the place where, one place. But the idea would then be that you could also have other agencies and other decisions similarly taking that into account through their decision making. So yeah. And then this is the other sort of enforceable piece. So our state has a state coastal zone management program. It's a federal program under the Federal Coastal Zone Management Act. And what states do is they develop a coastal program. They say what authorities, what laws they're going to use as part of their core piece of their coastal program. And we also then, by getting it approved by NOAA, get federal money to run that program. What happens is then federal projects or federally approved projects have to be consistent with the state's program. So they have to get what's called a federal consistency approval from the state. So when a project that is being permitted by the Army Corps of Engineers is being permitted, it has to get a federal consistency approval from the state if it's affecting our coastal zone. So it's a really powerful tool, or it can be, in terms of helping guide federal actions. And our state law for marine spatial planning requires us to take our plan that we develop for the coast and submit it to NOAA to be included in our state's coastal program. So then that would help sort of strengthen the tie there in terms of not just state waters where we actually have jurisdiction, but federal waters where an activity might be affecting our coastal resources. So that's the place where we don't have direct jurisdiction over federal waters, but where we can point the feds to things that we think are important or that are going to impact important resources to our coast. So similarly on the federal side, there's this whole alphabet soup of agencies involved. Some of them you're quite familiar with off of here, the sanctuary, the national park, the refuges. But there are other ones, right? There's the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which actually does leases for offshore renewable energy as well as oil and gas. There's the Army Corps of Engineers, NOAA Fisheries. So there's this whole alphabet soup out there that this can help bring those agencies to the table in conversation. And I talked about the National Ocean Policy. Again, large regions developed by what they're calling regional planning bodies, or RPBs. And those are made up of the states, tribes, and federal agencies. So those are the people that are invited to sit at the table and develop these broader plans that are across the large area. And it's really at the early stage. Too early to say the details right now because, for example, funding. There's no funding for the federal agencies at this point in time to implement this. There is an acknowledgement that they'll build off of state plans. And so the federal agencies have seen these states going forward with plans at the state level and acknowledge that that these broader regional plans can build off of those state plans so that those can plug into the bigger effort or feed into that bigger effort. Okay, so a little bit on status. I mentioned that the law got passed, then we did this report to the legislature. In the interim, we started establishing the advisory council as well as working with the tribes on what that relationship's going to look like, how we're going to communicate on ocean policy. We also worked on a data inventory and held some workshops on human use data and how do we collect data on how humans are using the ocean. And then the state law and amendments went through, as well as funding. So I mentioned funding. Legislature gave Department of Natural Resources $2.1 million to implement marine spatial planning between now and the end of June of next year. So it's a lot of money to try and push out the door and get some projects done in a short amount of time. And the reason Department of Natural Resources was given that authority is that the money is coming from their aquatic lands enhancement account, which is money made up off of those leases that I mentioned earlier, among other activities. So that's why they've got that authority and that responsibility for getting the money out the door. They're working, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but we're working really closely with everybody else on what that plan looks like. So where are we going? We're working right now on that state plan for the funding, pre-planning activities, projects, and we're also at the same time working on a state strategy that will help us identify the path forward beyond June 30th of 2013. So where do we go from there? How do we take this through to the end? And so launching the planning process maybe by June 30th of 2013, if the legislature comes through with continued funding, then we could actually maybe complete a planning process in a couple of years. And this is another way of looking at it. We're thinking that the pre-planning process is right now, then launching the actual process will require ongoing money. This is a way of breaking down some of these stages. In this part, things like identifying resources, and by that we mean human uses and natural resources, mapping those things out, it's gathering all that information, getting everything kind of ready to go. So that's really what we're looking at doing in the next year, is getting everything kind of ready to go so that we would be ready to then launch a more formal planning process where we start getting into the meat of understanding what impacts are going on and developing a plan. So the funding categories that we're looking at right now, these are the large categories that we're looking at: mapping activities, ecosystem assessment, data tools, and stakeholder engagement. And those line up with the law and the things that we have to complete in the law, but they also, the budget proviso that gave the money to DNR, there was direction there. So those make a lot of sense to us, and we're engaging the marine resource committees, tribes, stakeholders, and state agencies in identifying project priorities for funding. So just some final thoughts. You know, I'm a planner, so I think planning makes sense, but it makes sense from a lot of perspectives. From the economic perspective, to make sure we're maximizing what we can get from the ocean, to sustain the environment, and to sustain our cultural practices and our traditional uses that we want to keep for our future generations. And the involvement of you all is critical. Your ideas and your perspectives are really important to making that process work. Another really important thing is that marine spatial planning can solve some issues, but not all of them. Ocean acidification is not going to be solved by this planning process, unfortunately. You know, there are some things that are happening on a scale that is just way beyond this one location in terms of global forcing. And we're just getting started. We've got a pretty solid framework underway, but we've got a long ways to go, and look forward to talking with you more and engaging with you more as we get on that path. So, just one other slide. So we do have a website. It's unfortunately a little bit out of date. I haven't had a chance to update it lately. But it does provide some good links to that legislative report I mentioned and some other links on marine spatial planning and my contact information. So if you have any questions that you don't get answered today or that you think of later on, I'm happy to answer them via email or on the phone.
So as Jennifer ended on the note with the Shoreline Master Program, that's a great segue to talk about a planning tool that we developed for the Pacific County Marine Resources Committee to help them perform essentially data characterization, data inventory on various marine resources that they're interested in. And being a natural resources-based county, you know, they have a stake in what goes on in marine waters when it comes to planning for the Shoreline Master Program update. So I want to talk about the Washington Marine Planner, which is a web-based decision support tool that we developed in conjunction with EcoTrust from Portland, Oregon, to help the Pacific County MRC address various issues related to marine resources and the SMP update. So as both Jennifer and Paul mentioned about the state of MSP legislation in Washington, 2010 was enacted. They identify renewable offshore energy as primary objective. So to that end, we developed this marine planning tool as an example of helping the county MRC kind of tackle the SMP update as an example of marine spatial planning within this larger state framework. So what is the Washington Marine Planner? It's a web-based decision support tool to permit stakeholder participation in CMSP, marine spatial planning, SMP updates, and the like. I think Paul touched on this about balancing tool functionality and its analytical capabilities with usability. So anyone that is familiar with just browsing the web and using Google Earth or Google Maps can sit down and use the tool. And they don't have to be a specialist because this is built on geographic information system data and software and analytics on the background. We're not requiring any sort of specialization in that. So we wanted to develop a tool that balances that functionality with just the user experience. So the Washington Marine Planner, or WMP, as I'll refer to it, was created in this cooperative agreement between us, the Nature Conservancy, and EcoTrust. And essentially it's comprised of an online data viewer, data catalog, and then these analytical tools that occur behind the scenes that stakeholders can identify particular areas that represent a particular management scenario of their interest. Thanks. So again, it includes this data viewer. In general, stakeholders can generate designs or areas of interest, or site designs as they're also called. They can be arbitrarily delineated based on a particular area of interest, or it can be more focused and driven by some analytical criteria that identify a particular place for, let's say, offshore wave energy based on distance to shore or depth of water, or the wave potential out there. And then we have reporting functionality in it that, based on your areas or your scenarios that you develop, it reports back, it drills down into a stack of data and it displays what's out there, how big is your area, if it's close to shore, how long is the coastline, how many seabird colonies are there, pinhead hollouts, things like that. And then based on those criteria driven designs, you can do a trade-off analysis that compares trade-offs between one management objective and the other. Okay, so the built-in functionality is this data viewer, the user created shapes and user drawn. So that's just standard functionality into the tool, and we'll actually, I think this is the last slide of text, we'll actually get into some screenshots in a moment, and actually see what the tool looks like and what it does. But then there's also project specific that, again, would represent a particular management objective, like either offshore energy or marine conservation and the like. And that's based on these user-created shapes, these reports, and then this trade-off analysis. Next. So this is a screenshot of the planning tool itself, the Marine Planner. On the left-hand side here, this is the online data viewer, the data catalog. We have in there almost 150 data sets. There's 3 general categories of human use, physical and biological. Off the top of my head, I think human use is about 80 data layers. The physical is about 35 layers. 35 layers, and I think the biological is about 35 or 40 layers in there. And the data are compiled from a variety of sources, both state, federal, and local. So varying data resolutions, varying data extents. We've also contributed a number of data sets from our marine eco-regional assessment, which is essentially, it's a planning, conservation planning analysis that's region-wide in scope. It goes from the point of Cape Flattery down to Cape Mendocino in California. And a large number of data sets are combined together, And based on some conservation criteria, we identify suitable areas for conservation based on the stack of input data. And some key data that we included from there are benthic data, benthic habitat, so seafloor geology, seafloor geoform or geomorphology, and in depth, and then also some shoreline and estuary characteristics as well. Next. This is an example of this user-drawn shape. You'll hear me refer to it as a site design or an area of interest. So essentially, in the tool there is functionality where a user can outline an area of interest that may correspond to a place that they recreate on, or maybe they harvest crab, or they're out fishing, or wherever. And they can draw these regional size shapes. And you can exclude out federal waters or state waters or estuaries or land areas, so you can limit its extent to wherever your specific area of interest is. Next. And so moving into the project specific, this is where we get into this scenario analysis that evaluates different management objectives. And in there right now we have the management objective for renewable energy, offshore renewable energy, wind, wave, and tidal. And we have a management objective for marine conservation, so benthic conservation, nearshore conservation, and then open water conservation. And in here, you can specify specific data layers that represent, either, again, going back to the wave energy example, either wave potential, bottom type, depth, and then also distance to shore as well. And there's various sliders in there, and your users can adjust the values and things like that. Next. And then this is the reporting option. So based on this area of interest that's drawn here, that excludes anything on the landward side, is in the state waters and includes the coastline, you can report out, there's physical, so what the habitat is like, and also biological, so you have seabirds, marine mammals, plants, and invertebrates. And what it does is, based on a stack of data, it drills down and it extracts out what all this shape is overlaying. And then the last aspect of this project-specific functionality is this multi-objective trade-off analysis, and this has to do with those management objectives, so the renewable energy and then the marine conservation. And it gives a nice graphical plot of how these compare. And these are based on these user-defined shapes or these areas of interest. So a user creates a collection of these, and then they're scored automatically by the system, and then it plots it up on these axes, so 0 to 100, 0 to 100. So this is viability for wind energy, and this is viability for conservation. So depending on where they plot out, indicates kind of a relative score of suitability there. So again, looking a little bit more in detail at some of the functionality, the workflow for the data layers or the online data catalog, over 120, nearing 150 so far. Various marine boundaries, terrestrial boundaries, marine industry, shipping lanes, military uses, infrastructure, conservation areas, various power potentials for renewable energy, seafloor and nearshore characteristics, and then the biological characteristics as well. And this is, the data catalog is kind of an ongoing development. It started focused on Pacific County, so there are some county-specific data sets in there, but with the advent of looking ahead to a coastal planning process, we've included regional data sets that include the coast-wide extent. So the workflow for the Shoreline Master Program update, again, we developed this for the Marine Resources Committee to include marine issues in the SMP update. And this is driven by that area of interest or that user-defined shape. So again, user can draw the shape that represents, this is, for example, the mouth of Grays Harbor, a little bit inside the harbor and a little bit offshore in there. It excludes all the land in there. Next. And then based on that site, it reports out, again, these various attributes of what lies underneath. In general, it gives you the area, and then it gives you these objective scores. But more importantly, for the Shoreline Master Program, what we did is we consulted with the MRC to include in there some example issues that come up for the Shoreline Master Program when counties or municipalities are doing a data inventory or data characterization of what their resources are in their marine waters. And included in there beach erosion, shoreline use, public access, and aquaculture. And then the main screen here just gives a little bit of description about each and what they represent. And then if you click on each of the headings, it'll give you the report here. And based on what SMP issue it is, you know, we have slope for the beach erosion, structures, drift, and exposure. And so, again, in consultation with MRC, we devise what categories to report on. And there's little question marks right here, so users can click on those and they can find out a little bit more information about what those aspects are, how they're defined. Next. So again, this is just going through and showing for all the shoreline issues that are in there. For shoreline use, public access, and aquaculture, you know, what is your inventory underneath that particular area that a user would draw? Sure. So I'm going to switch gears and talk about the workflow as it's set up for coastal marine spatial planning. And the idea is that this is built, essentially, I mean, there's four components. There's the scenario analysis where you go through this criteria-driven selection that highlights areas off the coast that meet, in this case, criteria for offshore energy or marine conservation. You go through the process of drawing the user-defined shapes that represent your particular area of interest. You do the reporting, and then you do the trade-off analysis, and then you get into the user sharing and things like that. So the first step is just to, when you create a new scenario, you select what management objective you want. In this case, we're going to pick wind next. The step two is you can select which data layers represent or participate in your scenario analysis. Here we're going to pick distance to shore, depth, substrate or bottom type, and then wind potential, power potential. And again, they have the question marks on the end here. Find out more information about it, list the data source. I think, yeah, we put in the data source and then the year and just a little one-sentence explanation. Next. Here's step three. This is where you actually select the values for those data layers that you selected in the previous picture. So distance to shore, we're going to select 15 miles. We want a depth range of 150 to 500 feet. We want a bottom type of gravel, mud, sand, and shell. And then wind potential, we want good all the way up to superb. And it gives it in various units. So good represents 15.7 to 16.8 miles per hour, all the way up to greater than 19.7 miles per hour for the superb. Next, here is, you can give it a name, give it a description, and then this support file is where you upload any sort of supporting documentation that you have. Next.
So that's one way to get your local knowledge in there. You know of a published report, you can attach the published report. It doesn't have to be GIS data.
Right.
You can just attach the scientific paper.
So the results of the scenario, I don't know if you can see, but there's this long, thin section offshore here that represents that suitable area based on the criteria of depth, distance to shore, bottom type, and wind potential. And then it gives a graphical breakdown of the results here. And so this is different bottom types. This is a percentage of the scenario output as a whole. And then wind potential is the percentage of the scenario output. And then it starts to break down the bottom type based on wind potential. So it's all these different combinations of information as far as the amount, the percentage, the amount of area that's represented. Next. So after you create your analytical scenario, you can go in with your area of interest or user-defined shape. You can lasso an area. You can give it a name, and then you can find out more information about it. You can find out its area. You can find out how much the area and the percentage of available different depths, geoform, bottom type substrates, and then so this is physical for the marine conservation, benthic marine conservation. And then this is for the wind here, what your depth range is, your minimum, maximum, average, your area and percentage of available for your different bottom types, and then your area and percentage for your wind potential. Next. So then the third step is once you've created this collection of user-defined areas of interest, as long as you create more than two, for each you can conduct what's this trade-off analysis. So they're scored automatically by the tool, and the scoring layer, there's one for the 3 types of energy, and then there's a scoring layer for the marine conservation. And essentially what that does is it represents the suitability base of your site based on that scoring layer. And then it plots it up here, and you can click on each one of these circles, which represents your site of interest. The size of the circle represents the size and area of your relative size of your shape. It gives you your scores, gives you your area. And then the idea, so this is wind energy here from 0 to 100, 100 being the best possible suitability for there, 0 being the worst. And the idea is if all your sites you designed for wind energy fell up here, and all your sites you designed for conservation fell down here, then there would be no overlap, no potential conflict. But where things get interesting is where a site you designed for wind energy and a site you designed for conservation both plot up here in the upper right-hand corner. So suggesting a high suitability based on the planning tool for both wind and conservation. And so that's where the overlap is. That's where the potential conflicts based on the user or the stakeholder group. That's where negotiations start to take place among different user groups that participate in the process. And then you can just get a tabular version of the trade-off. And it says orange cells denote potential conflicts, green cells denote just kind of that objective is okay, or that area is okay for that. Sharing scenario and user shapes. And so from a management side, once we get into this planning process with stakeholders, we're going to need someone to manage those stakeholder groups and accounts. And so this is just an example of the tool functionality where you can go in and you can select the scenario you created, you can share it. This is our development team here, and it shows who all belongs to that team and who can see what and things like that. And so it makes it, I guess, restrictive because it's restricted to certain user groups and that are focused on whatever particular management objective. But also, if you just create your own user account, do your own thing, only you can see it.
Do you have an effect read-only so that any of us could get into it, play with it, but it goes away when we shut off?
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't have to register. You can
Right.
just look at it.
Yeah, you can go in and play with it anytime. So can somebody from New Jersey, right? And you don't want the guy from New Jersey making the management
Right,
decisions out
making
here.
changes on your own work, exactly.
But go further in your question, Rich, we could, for example, set up a user group for North Pacific MRC. And then you guys can have a conversation, be sharing your work around that group. And it's just in one place, nobody else sees it, you guys see it. When you're done with it, then you can post it to the mothership and, it becomes say, a proposal in the planning process.
Next. Okay, so, just to wrap this all up, we felt we had a pretty successful pilot project with the MRC, Pacific County MRC, for this. Developed a tool for them to use to identify marine resource issues for their S&P update. We got a tremendous amount of feedback, not only on the tool functionality, usability, but data. We delivered this to them in March, and I'm still working through data requests from them. We're going on the road. This is the road show for the Washington Marine Planner. Just to demonstrate the tool, its capabilities, its functionality. We are looking at scoping for expansion of management objectives, and that's, Jennifer mentioned, for the part of the pre-planning process is deciding on what management objectives will be considered for shoreline master, the CMSP, sorry. Right now it's just renewable energy and green conservation. We'd like to include much more, and then always continued addition of new data as new data sets are published. I have a contact at NOAA, NIMS. She alerted me to new critical habitat data for Ulicon. And so those data are coming available, and so as new data come available, authoritative sources, NIMS, it's peer reviewed, and they develop it, they go out for public comment, they consider public, and then they revise the data, and then it gets signed off, and then it's the data source.
Is it the last slide?
Next slide. So thank you very much for your time, attention, and your questions. This is the website, washington.marineplanning.org. Is the website. As it is, you can go on and you can browse through the online data inventory, and you can look at what data are up there. If you create an account, then you can gain access to the analytical tools. You can play around with the scenario analysis. You can play around with the user tools for areas of interest. You can do the trade-off analysis. And that's it. Thank you.
And there's a self-contained tutorial
Yes.
right on this site. So if you want to read the instructions on how to run the tool, they're right there. One other thing that occurs to me that I should explain is you can tell that this is still inadequate for what we would like to do with it for Washington's coast, for CMSP. And the reason that we call these pilot projects is it's two-way learning, right? You put something out, you get feedback, and you make adjustments as a consequence. But this is not something that's brand new, out of the box, never before seen. It's built on a steady progress of work that the Conservancy and EcoTrust have been involved in now for, almost 10 years, right?
MLPA in California was 2005. I think it started
Okay,
in
so
2003, so about
7
years, say 8 years.
So, this is yet another iteration, building on things that we've worked with in the past that have been used in other planning processes. And what we wanted to focus most on in the Pacific County pilot was this user interface, making the tool available to almost anybody that can use a computer. So that's why those parts of it are built out now. We didn't worry as much about comprehensive data and all of that kind of stuff as we were worried about developing the side of it that makes it usable by everybody.
or is it really realistic to think that this is going to be done in 2 years?
I hope so. I don't want it to take forever.
You know, but part of the reason that I think that it probably can be, Rob, although, stuff happens, right?
Yeah.
And we have to take time for everyone to be heard. But that aside, I think that Washington is really in good shape to do this process because of that list of things that I put on my last slide and the things that Jennifer's talked about. You know, this is not a case where anybody's coming out here saying, holy cow, we've got things wrong, and we've got to fix it. It's quite a different situation. And one of the reasons that the Nature Conservancy is so interested in working on Washington's coast is because the coast and ocean is in good shape here. You can be proactive, you can establish a vision for what you want this place to be in the future, and use this tool to keep it. There's a lot of really strong public policy already in the state of Washington for this coast. There's good fisheries management on the west coast of the United States. So we've got a rich situation. It's more of a case of using this as a conserving and protecting tool than it is to fix, you know, big problems. And I think that's a reason to be optimistic about the planning timeframe.
And I think one thing that a lot of folks will acknowledge when you start talking about planning is that it really is, and I hate to say this, but an ongoing process. So as situations change, as new information comes to light, that you do need to revisit it, and that you need to acknowledge that you're not going to get it 100% right the first time around. You need to do sort of the best job you can, and then with the resources you have at hand, and then revisit it later down the road. But I think trying to make it perfect will make it take longer than 2 years. Trying to make it really good, we could probably get there in 2 years. Maybe I'm just being optimistic.
In most mapping protocols and structures and outputs, there's a disclaimer about the accuracy or what is actually known. And so I'm wondering what your sense is about the data that's included here and how complete the data sets are, and whether or not there's information that you can drill farther in to find out when the last update was to each data set, et cetera.
That's a great question. There's a lot into that question.
Yes,
There's a lot
there
packed
is.
in there. So what we've done on the data viewer side, we've identified what the data set is, what the data layer is, its source, if it's fed, state, local, TNC, industry, whatever, the year that it was created, and then if a user clicks on the name, it's kind of like a hyperlink that pops up this little message box that gives a little bit of information about what the data represents, how it's collected, scale limitations, extent, if it's like part of an ongoing process, if it's updated regularly, things like that, or if it's just kind of a one-off data collection, things like that.
So it's like a right click to get the metadata, is that what you're saying?
Exactly, yeah. So it's kind of an abridged version of metadata for that particular data layer. And it represents the best available data at the time of collection, recognizing that there are a lot of, particularly for the human side, particularly recreation, there's just not a lot known about recreational use on the outer coast. I mean, we know people, we've all been to Westport, we've seen people surfing off of there, but for the life of me, I couldn't find GIS data about surfing recreation off of Westport, Grays Harbor. We know people come out here for wildlife viewing, but again, trying to find those data that are in a format digestible by this tool, it's not readily available. So we acknowledge that the data aren't perfect. We don't have data on everything that's out there, and even working with the MRC, there is some local knowledge that some of the fishermen have that we just can't capture at a regional scale. Yes?
thank you for that explanation, but when thinking about the SMP, and I've done the Shoreline Master Program update for Jefferson County, I was on the technical advisory committee, and one of the the SMP is built on the ecosystem environment platform, and then the human uses added on top of that to evaluate water-dependent uses, but to protect the ecological, the processes and functions of the ecosystem. And so what I'm wondering is, so forage fish, salmon, and you said pinniped and seabirds, but the rest of
The rest of the ecosystem.
the rest of it.
I would, my answer to this in a generic sense is that we're at a point in the development process, right?
Yeah,
And Ecology's done a great job with their other state agencies of, holding these data gap workshops and getting the experts in the room to talk about where do we have good data, what's imperfect about it, what other data don't we have and need to get in the wheelhouse, and that's a substantial amount of work to be done.
I guess one of the questions I had, going through this and part of the conference call, we were looking at the data layers. What do you do when you find that something's missed? The one I'll pick on was the processors, commercial fish processors. And they don't exist apparently north of the Mason-Dixon, the Grays Harbor, and don't show back up until you're in Port Townsend or Port Angeles.
That's an artifact of point in development too.
Well, but okay, so the data layer came from somewhere, and the only way I could reconcile in my mind is it must have came from the Department of Revenue or someplace where the processors that I'm aware of wouldn't necessarily be picked up in a state tax because they're on tribal nations. Quinault Pride wasn't there. That was the first, what? Quilliut's High Tide wasn't there. The one up at Macaw wasn't there. So it's like, okay. And in our sense, that means there may be a whole data layers that are missing that some could then say, well, see, you don't have, and I've actually heard it, you really don't have a commercial fishing industry up there. You don't have processors, you don't have this, you don't have that. You can use the data layer.
well, that's because when you look at the maps, the whole thing is grayed out, right?
Well, no,
The
actually,
whole reservation is gray
well, I know,
on
but
the
it-
USGS or the DNR maps. There
It's-
is nothing there.
it's almost more interesting to look at the importance of fishing grounds. And then to see the coloration that kind of, as we go north, the Yankees don't apparently fish, and
So do you want to deal with the processor data set?
So I'll field I'll field the data processor, and then also first I'll address, this is where partnering with local stakeholders like yourselves is extremely important. And these are the exact things that we learned about by partnering with the Pacific County MRC is, where are some key data gaps? Because you're absolutely right. If you just looked at the processor data layer that's up on the marine planner as it is right now, one would make the logical conclusion that there's no marine there's no processing north of Grays Harbor. So the source of that data layer, in lieu of any other official data set, was actually Department of Ecology regulated facilities that was queried out for marine industry, seafood processors, I think a couple other marine industries as well.
Based on the water quality discharge permits.
Exactly. So the caveat is that only those facilities that are monitored and regulated by Department of Ecology are included in it. So
I guess the concern I've got, and it's going back to this one paper, Axioms of Natural Resource Policy. The policy makers are probably not going to go to the detail of trying to ferret out why you did or didn't have that there. There's only a few policymakers I'm aware of who even know what the phrase metadata means. And so maps are seen as very powerful tools and have been for centuries. And so if it's not on the map, it doesn't exist.
So with great power comes great responsibility.
Yeah, well,
And-
normally the policies are made after, and then we
Well,
deal with the responsibility.
And I would say, so this tool was developed for a particular project. In terms of what I was talking about, in terms of the marine spatial planning process, we're just getting started. We've got some funding to do some good work, to fill data gaps that we're aware of, and start the conversation about how do we make the maps that we do have more reflective of reality, and make sure that we're plugging the holes on the ecosystem side, on the human uses side, so that we can have as complete a picture as we can to work with. Now, getting back to my 2-year comment, it's not gonna be perfect, we're not gonna have every single piece of data that we need, but we can do, and that's where involvement of stakeholders, of other agencies, of tribes, to be able to have that conversation and provide that information for the planning process, so.
So the first rule of good planning is don't be stupid. And I've had plenty of opportunity to watch planning processes get off and on foot because the information underneath is bad. This is one of the reasons why I'm personally dedicated to getting these planning tools into the hands of ordinary people, because you've got the knowledge. And it's a backstop against being stupid with planning systems, okay? And my first experience using anything like this in a very rudimentary fashion was in a really thick and contentious situation. It was trying to plan for a national marine sanctuary in the Florida Keys. And everybody in that county was living inside the boundaries of the National Marine Sanctuary. Okay? And we just had a terrible, terrible time with some difficult decisions about resource management, how to separate conflicting uses. We had a lot of really serious and contentious things going on out there. Like, you know, one boat showing up and dropping 40 tourists in the water with snorkels and masks on, and a charter boat backing up to the same reef top to use cast nets to catch the bait fish that way. You get into a few conflicts that way, right? So we thought we were in one of the most data-rich, most studied parts of the ocean, right? Florida Keys, University of Miami is less than 100 miles away, less than 30 miles away if you're in Key Largo, and yet we would put the data sets together, they didn't give us the information we needed. As soon as we started putting tools in the hands of the local people to map out what they knew was going on and where stuff was, the planning process got much, much, much richer. We did not have all the computerized systems and stuff like that, but we did get good maps going and good process to get information from local people, and basically loaded that data in. It was just all manual systems, but we got that stuff on the maps, and then the picture started to sort itself out, and everybody could see the logic of kind of, you know, constraining themselves a little bit so that each of the many ways of making money off of that chunk of ocean could continue. It's a breakthrough, but you've got to have both the scientific data translated into this mappable stuff and the interaction with ordinary people who are out there in the water and know what's going on. That's why it works. So we're just at this point in time and process, and we know that this has got a lot of holes. But what's important is we're building the tool, and we'll let Matt step through the other parts of the functionality of it, so that we trap these problems out. We know the problems are there.
I guess the concern I've got is we know problems are there, we know data gaps are there. And at the same time, we're going to create a plan with policies. And usually what happens then is either the policy is extremely overly broad and overly protective, or it's not well defined and thought out.
Well, keep in mind what Jennifer said. This is a plan that's going to help educate and integrate existing policies and regulations.
I see. Someone will take the bait at the back. She was close.
I took it, I just didn't say that. I'll get you later.
Forgive me for thinking I was the audience for your question.
He was just looking at you.
Well, but I mean, that is one of the concerns though. I mean, and what
Should
we've
be.
seen on the upland side of things
Mhm.
is that then it's like, well, we don't know much about the warty jumping slug, so let's create a half-mile protective zone around a slug that can jump the size of my fingernail. Okay, that has huge commercial implications based upon a, we don't know. Literally, someone had checked a, we don't know box.
So here's
And,
my,
and so how do we avoid that in a very tight time frame?
the other driver in these systems is that if you don't have a decision pending, there's no priority to go get data. By putting the decisions on the table, you create the driver to go get the data. Fisheries management is the best example of this in the world. If we don't hook them and yank them out of the ocean and sell them, we don't study them.
So Matt, are you gonna get to what Paul was just saying about how the local community brings data to this process, or is this, I just want to, well, why don't you go ahead and.
Well, so that's a very important point. So there's two ways that local knowledge can be incorporated into this. One is by those user-defined areas of interest. So people can digitize in their lasso an area that represents their favorite fishing spot or the warty jumping slug or whatever, the exact range or whatever, or something like that. The other way is you can actually upload data to this. So if you have, and it's the Google Earth format right now, and so you have to convert it to Google Earth and then you can upload it into Earth. And then you can combine it with the various data that are in the data catalog. Either heads up digitize it, trap it out, however you want to do that. And with your user-defined areas of interest, you can also upload other, like either reports or some sort of ancillary documents that kind of substantiate the decision of why you drew, where you drew, and what it means and what it represents. And so it's good, bookkeeping for yourself. But then when you get into the planning process, the idea is that we would have different stakeholder groups that would interact among themselves, and they say, hey, I'm designing this over here, and these are the reasons why.